Where's Danae? Oh, she's here. Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to get going. Thank you so much for being here. This is the first School of Sustainability seminar of the year. Good to see everyone after the summer. Myself and Danae Hernandez-Cortez plan these seminars. We have 1 or 2 per month. So we really appreciate everyone coming today for our first one of the year. We have some people who are not part of the School of Sustainability here to come see this presentation because we have some important outside guests that have joined us here at ASU this week as part of a National Science Foundation grant that we have here. So today we have 4 speakers. I'll go first, and we're all going to be talking broadly about how we view from our own lens what heat adaptation looks like in different populations across the globe. James Smallcombe from the University of Sydney will go after me. Nicole Vargas from Australian National University will go after James. And then Nick Ravanelli, he is on his way to Singapore right now. So he recorded a video for us, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So I'm going to kick it off. And I don't think I need to do too much justification for this group of people for why heat is important to study. Just some quick numbers so far this year. We've had 150 confirmed deaths due to heat in Maricopa County, with 443 under investigation. Last summer alone, there were 645 deaths due to heat. And that's just deaths, not even thinking about the illnesses and all the hospitalizations that occur due to heat. And so today's talk is going to be focused around this development of a global center for heat adaptation that we were awarded by the National Science Foundation. So it's the development of a global center, and then we'll be able to go for a large implementation of the global center in a year or 2. But the focus of the center is to really bring together a consortium of researchers who look at this same problem from very different lenses, and to find new ways to think about it and study it. And this week, we're really focused on our first research objective, which is networking and coordination and integration around use-inspired heat adaptation, given our different disciplines. And then today, we'll also be talking about a pilot test of measurements that we're doing with a system called the Heat Suite at the household and individual level to look at exposures, responses, and adaptations. The team is growing. But in general, with this proposal, we had to have teams from the US, Canada, and either UK or Australia. So that's kind of the base foundation of it. And then we're growing to other countries. Nick has now moved to Singapore. We are going to be doing research also in Colombia over the winter. And so overall, I forget, it's 8 institutions, a handful of different disciplines that are currently part of it. And we're looking to expand that as well, and then a mix of faculty and graduate students. And then we have Angela Grobstein, who is our fabulous project manager. So yeah, this week is all about kind of thinking about our networking coordination and really exchanging information. And yesterday we went on a field trip to downtown Phoenix to really understand some of what the City of Phoenix Heat Office is doing and what other community level heat adaptations are going on. So we went to the Burton Bar Library, and they have a cool container, the Justice Center, which we're doing some research with, and the new safe outdoor space ran by the City of Phoenix. So that's just an example of, we're not just sticking in our conference room and talking about this problem. We're going out there, we're overheating ourselves in the parking lots, and we're seeing what it's like. It was pretty hot yesterday. And we're talking with the communities that are on the grounds, helping the most vulnerable populations in our community. And we're trying to expose researchers from different locations in the world to what is the situation in Phoenix. And then eventually we'll be able to learn what's the situation in other countries and cities of the world for heat, because it's going to look different. And some of our guiding research questions with this design phase largely revolve around understanding different climates, hot and dry, hot and humid. How hot is it? Different cities, cultures, and what the behavior looks like for different coping strategies there. Even social connections are a very big part of all of this. The intensity and duration of heat exposures in indoor and transient environments. Think about walking to the bus, which is a bigger issue here than in other places that have better transit systems. different intrinsic and extrinsic factors that impede our ability to manage heat extremes, and how do the perceptions of heat differ across people? How does it impact their danger in the heat and different locations? And then what motivates cool-seeking behavior? Nicole will be talking about that later. So all of these are open questions. And I will say, like, in this area of research, there's tons of open questions and people are looking at it in very different ways. If we think about adaptation the way the IPCC defines it, the ability of a system or region or community to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So then for our purposes, we're really trying to get down to the household or personal level of heat adaptation. And then the way the IPCC would frame kind of the 4 basic levels of heat or of climate change adaptation goes to physiological, behavioral, infrastructural, and technological. And those are all looked at in different ways by different disciplines, which is one of the reasons I wrote this grant with these colleagues, because I find that very interesting in how we're all looking at it differently. As an example, here's how heat vulnerability is framed, and where heat adaptive capacity would kind of fit into this Venn diagram. And this comes from some classic social vulnerability research. Sharon Harlan, who some of you know, did a lot of this research while she was here at ASU. But I think when we look at these overlapping or these intersecting parts, what is interesting to me is what heat vulnerability indices really look at in terms of exposure and cooling resources and education. That's kind of the data they use to get at heat vulnerability. But what physiologists are looking at is more of physical illnesses. What medications are people taking? What's their age? What's their health status? What's their acclimatization? And something like acclimatization is seen as both an adaptive capacity or a sensitivity. And so there's this link. So at any given heat exposure, you're going to have different groups that are maybe safe because they have high adaptive capacity and low sensitivity, or very unsafe because they're very, very sensitive. So you can think of our older or unhoused neighbors, and then they have low adaptive capacity. And so then trying to bring in this heat cascade, going from just overall heat stress to a heat strain, is what James is going to really focus on as a thermal physiologist on the team. But that's what we're really trying to then bring into this kind of framework of thinking from a social lens into an exposure lens, into the actual heat impacts lens from a physiological standpoint. But there's a big problem in that there's minimal data in these buckets. So like I said, we do well kind of generally with exposure by using some satellite information. We do okay with using census data to get some of this information, but there's a lot of missing data at the personal and household level, and especially for people who don't even have an address. So how do we start to tackle some of this? But behavior is a big component, those city to person level adaptations that are going on, and then those personal sensitivities. So we're really focused on a lot of this with this grant. My last important note is just on how we define heat. So heat is not air temperature. It's often said that way, but when in our group, I think we all agree that heat is air temperature plus wind speed plus radiation plus humidity. You have to use all of those factors to really understand overall heat exposure. And then if we really want to know heat stress, you bring in clothing and activity. So that's heat stress. And when you apply it to the entire heat cascade to get to a heat health outcome that's survivable or livable or deadly, that's what James is going to be getting into. And so that's the framework I approach things from, to really understand what does exposure mean. And then when we think about personal heat exposure, I think about populations that are really heat impacted. So if the air temperature at the airport changes, their personal exposure changes. That's the gray line there. A person who is not impacted by that change in the airport weather station is not really impacted by heat. They might have a high adaptive capacity. And these are different groups of populations that we need to study and understand and try and move that gray line down so that people who are highly impacted are less exposed to heat as the first step, so that we don't even start along that heat cascade. So with that, I'm going to end and pass it over to James, just saying there's minimal data even on personal heat or personal air temperature exposure, let alone overall heat exposures. And so, and linking then that to the physiological and behavioral responses in the real world is minimal and scant in the research literature. And this is really important data when we know here that some years up to 40% of deaths are indoors. And a lot of those are people living in a place like a manufactured or mobile home. And so how can we start to study those? And that's just what we're doing as part of our second research objective of this grant, and looking at using our heat suite system that Dr. Ravanelli will talk about in the last presentation. So I'm going to turn it over now to James, then he'll turn it over to Nicole, and then we'll have Nick go to really get at this research goal that we have for this development grant. Or you don't have to clap.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's James Smallcombe, and I'm from the Heat and Health Research Centre at the University of Sydney. The director of this research centre is Professor Ollie Jay. He was supposed to be here with you today to give the talk. Unfortunately, he has to talk to the Australian Parliament today instead. So he sent me, so you've got the B team, but I'll do my best to do the centre justice. So I'm a thermal physiologist, and I'm interested in the impacts of extreme heat on human health. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about the research that we do in Sydney in the Heat and Health Research Centre and some of the physiological considerations of extreme heat exposure. So what do we do in Sydney at the Heat and Health Research Centre? Well, our aim is to serve as a platform for multidisciplinary research that generates comprehensive and crucially sustainable solutions to the complex issue of extreme heat. And as we know, extreme heat can affect us across our entire lifespan. And this starts, it can affect us both physiologically and more holistically across the entire lifespan. And this can start during pregnancy, when pregnant women are exposed to hot weather. Babies and infants may be exposed to temperature extremes in the hospital or whilst being transported around hot cities. And then, of course, as we move into childhood, children may be exposed to extreme heat whilst at school, in the classroom, or engaging in youth sport. And then, of course, as we move into adulthood, there are a variety of different settings where extreme heat can be a problem, whether it be in the workplace, during recreational activities, or just going about our daily lives. And then as we advance into older age, things become a little bit more complicated because we become physiologically more vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat. And we also become more likely to develop other disease states that can exacerbate the impacts of extreme heat. So the elderly population is a particular population of concern for us as physiologists. So this figure really demonstrates that a variety of populations are impacted by extreme heat in different ways, physiologically, and therefore the solutions that we can implement are going to have to differ depending on the target population. So our philosophy in the Heat and Health Research Centre really focuses on this problem to solution framework. I think Jenni did a really nice job just now of highlighting the general problem of heat on health. I think the impacts are well established. And once we've identified a heat health problem, the next step is to try to understand some of the underlying mechanisms. Now, as a physiologist, I'm often interested in the physiological mechanisms that contribute to the problem, but these mechanisms may also be financial, societal, or a combination of many different factors. Once we have a bit of an understanding of the mechanisms, we can then start to think about potential solutions to the problem. But of course, once we've come up with some ideas, we first need to test these to see if they're effective or not. And this kind of proof of principle testing is often conducted in the lab because it's a controlled setting in which we can do good experimental work. Once we've honed into the solutions that seem to do a good job and seem to be effective at mitigating the negative impacts of heat stress, we then need to upscale this testing, do more robust, larger scale testing, sometimes in the field, or in some cases in a full-blown clinical trial. But of course, the work doesn't stop there, and arguably the most important step is then the translation of those research findings back into the community to influence changes in either policy or practice to really solve the problem that we first identified. And of course, to successfully complete this cycle, we need a wide range of different expertise. Us as physiologists can't do all of these steps. That's why the collaboration with other groups and other disciplines is so important. Now, Jenni has already shown you this figure and focused on heat stress and what that constitutes. Today, I'm going to focus more on the next step down the line. I'm going to focus on the development of physiological heat strain and the adverse impacts that can have on human health. So I'm really going to talk about some of the consequences of heat strain. We're going to talk about some of the physiological systems that are stressed when we're under heat stress. And we're going to touch upon those who may be most vulnerable to extreme heat and some of the reasons why. Now, as most of us probably know, our internal body temperature, our core body temperature, is tightly regulated around the 37 degrees Celsius mark, about 98 degrees Fahrenheit for you guys. And in hot weather, anything above approximately 35 degrees, the main way that we can keep cool is through the evaporation of sweat. That's really the only effective mechanism to dissipate heat from the body. In contrast, when it's hot, we can gain heat from the environment, from radiant sources, such as solar radiation from the sun, or we can gain heat into our body via convection as we either move through hot air or hot air is blown onto us. So in very simple terms, if the amount of heat that's coming into our body outweighs the heat that we can dissipate, these conditions become uncompensable. Our body temperature is invariably going to begin to rise. And this is when we can get ourselves into trouble and begin to develop heat-related illnesses. So when our body temperature does begin to rise uncontrollably and we move beyond 37, 38, 39 degrees Celsius, it can impact us in a number of ways from a physiological kind of perspective. The first way that it can cause us illness is through classic heat stroke. This is something that many of you have probably heard of. Heat stroke is often confused with heat exhaustion. Heat stroke is a medical emergency that requires urgent treatment. And this is when your body becomes so hot that your body cells begin to degrade and die. It can lead to organ failure and it can ultimately be fatal. What many other people don't necessarily appreciate is that lots of people don't die from classic heat stroke when they are exposed to heat, but they can succumb to cardiovascular related problems due to the additional cardiovascular strain placed on the body when we get hot. And then finally, dehydration is a major problem. As we progressively dehydrate, that places great strain on the kidneys, especially in those with pre-existing renal disease. There's quite a lot of information on this slide. So to save me talking you through this, we've actually developed quite a nice animation that just summarizes this, which I'll play for you quickly now. It's just about 45 seconds. There's just some music, it's okay. So that just skip that one. So that just gives you a nice summary as to some of the physiological events that occur when we start to experience hypothermia. And if we think about our communities and our families and those that may be most vulnerable to the development of heat-related illness, then there are a number of different populations that spring to mind. So older adults, especially above the age of 65, are considered vulnerable to heat strain as their bodies begin to degrade. and they become less able to physiologically adapt to the heat and keep themselves cool. And they also, people that are also suffering from comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease, renal disease, they're also considered more vulnerable, as are those that are on certain types of prescription medication. Yesterday, during our tour of the city of Phoenix, the issue of poverty, social isolation became very apparent. Those subgroups are also considered at risk when hot weather strikes, as are those individuals that are very physically active in the heat, such as athletes or occupations which are very physically demanding. And then babies and children come into the at-risk category too, partly due to their physiology and partly perhaps due to their behavioral limitations, which Nicole will talk more about later. So how do we study the physiological responses during a heat stress exposure? Well, myself as a physiologist, I spend a lot of time at the university in a climate chamber. This is our climate chamber in Sydney. And what this enables us to do is simulate any kind of heat stress conditions that we're likely to encounter on Earth. So our chamber can go from 5 degrees Celsius all the way up to 55 degrees Celsius. And we can very precisely control humidity, radiation, and wind in the chamber. So we can recreate conditions that the public may experience during a hot weather event. So this not only allows us to better understand the physiological consequences of heat exposure, but we can also test different low-cost, sustainable cooling strategies in the chamber to establish which ones work best, which are most protective, and which may best be rolled out into the community to protect the public during heatwave events. So that's kind of my day job back in Sydney. Now, one question we often get asked is, well, can we physiologically adapt to the heat? Can we, if we're exposed to heat regularly, do we become better at coping with the heat? And in short, the answer in some cases can be yes. If we're regularly exposed to high temperatures and regularly exposed to elevations in our core temperature, there are many physiological adaptations that can occur to help protect us when it gets hot. Some of these include an increased blood plasma volume. This helps reduce the cardiovascular strain we experience. We see improvements in thermal comfort. We see increased sweat rates, which helps with heat dissipation. And we see an increase in exercise or work capacity. On the flip side, we see a reduction in core temperature, reduced heart rates, and lower skin temperatures. All of these things are beneficial. And some of these adaptations can start to occur after 2, 3, 4 days of extreme heat exposure. But for full adaptation to occur, many of these require much longer, 10 to 14 days for full adaptation. And crucially, in order for these adaptations to take place, we need regular and extended exposures to extreme heat with elevated body temperatures. Now, that might be feasible for a worker working on a building site that's very physically active for 8 hours a day. They may experience that kind of physiological stimulus required for them to adapt. But for many people working in offices or spend a lot of time in air conditioning, it's probably not realistic that they're going to be fully acclimatized to the heat. So that's kind of an interesting question from a kind of a public health perspective. Now, my final slide is just, it touches upon the intersection of human physiology and human behavior from a heat health perspective. Now, what this figure shows is our adaptive capacity to respond to environmental heat stress can change depending on our stage of life and a physiological condition. So, for example, a young adult may have a very high physiological adaptive capacity, as well as a very good behavioral adaptive capacity, which means that they can very well protect themselves when it gets hot. An older individual, however, may be both physiologically impaired and have limited behavioral adaptive capacity, which places them at much greater risk than the younger individual during a heat stress exposure. If we now throw into the mix an older adult that also has cardiovascular disease, whilst their behavioral adaptive capacity may be retained, their physiological adaptive capacity is even further reduced, which means they're likely even more vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat than a healthy older individual. However, if we put that same older adult with cardiovascular disease, but give them access to air conditioning, for example, whilst they're still physiologically impaired, their behavioral adaptive capacity to keep cool and safe is drastically improved, and we can almost completely mitigate their risk during a heat exposure. So this just introduces the idea of the interplay between physiology and behavior, which brings me on to Nicole's presentation. So thank you. That's all I have for you today.
Thank you, James. Thanks, Jenny, for having us here. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. So I'm just going to start with this really wonderful image that I love, and it kind of encompasses what we're talking about when we think of behavioral thermoregulation or cooling behaviors. This comes from obviously the New York Times. Earth is overheating. Millions are already feeling the pain, and depicts this young gentleman pouring water over their head, which itself is a behavioral response to that heat that we might feel. Really, when I started this work, I'm a descendant of Associate Professor Zach Schlater, and also from the Heat and Health Research Incubator. And coming from those labs, I really started to try and conceptualize what it means to engage in behavior and what it means to be vulnerable to extreme heat. And the three kind of levels to this that I can come up with are really thinking about vulnerability at that epidemiological level. What do we see from morbidity and mortality at hospitals due to heat waves? What are those social determinants that come to play in terms of who's vulnerable to heat? And obviously, from our perspective and our lens, we really look closely at that individual level and how that contributes to the extreme or the vulnerability to extreme heat itself. Now, this kind of comes back to what James and Jenny have talked about already, but we've conceptualized this idea of an extreme heat risk matrix, where we, on the x-axis, can have physiological vulnerability, and on the y-axis, we can have behavioral vulnerability. And it's that intersection of these two that really can increase our risk of negative health outcomes during an extreme heat event. And so I'm going to focus on what's on that y-axis and how do we, what contributes to behavioral vulnerability, and what are the factors that are contributing to that behavior itself. So these are not new and novel ideas. Everybody understands what it means to behave during heat, especially here in Phoenix. We drink extra water, we take a break from activity, take off clothing that we have, or try and seek shelter if we can do it. But one of the primary kind of notions that comes out of this is that unlike our physiological responses that some other thermal physiologists really focus on, our behavioral responses really are unlimited, and they can offer the greatest protection from heat itself. So an early study that was done in Zach's lab at the University at Buffalo was to actually look at the order of recruitment of what we call thermoeffectors. So our primary thermoeffectors being the rediversion of of blood from the core out to our skin, and also sweating. But we also consider engaging in cooling behavior a thermoeffector itself, because it's going to help maintain our core body temperature. And really, I'm not going to go into detail here, but what we found is that cool-seeking behavior does seem to offer a level of protection against using some of those more physiologically demanding resources, such as sweating. You see skin blood flow increases a bit before our cooling behavior, but that's really withdrawal of our autonomic nervous signal to vasoconstriction, as opposed to active vasodilation. So really, our cooling behaviors seem to defend our core temperature and also those greater physiological resources that we have. Now, all of this coming together, I started to think about what are the things that can underpin cooling behaviors, or the factors that modify cooling behaviors. And the primary ones, this came out in a call to action kind of that we published a couple years ago in Nature Human Behavior, where we really want to prioritize understanding what underpins behavior in extreme heat. So the primary factors that we really consider are access. Do people have access to the resources that they need? Experience, what is the experience already of the population? Have they some level of adaptation that's occurring? Motivation behind engaging in these cooling behaviors? And finally, individual perception and how we perceive the environment around us and whether or not that results in behaving appropriately. So I'm going to kind of go backwards through these, and we're going to start with the idea of perception, which we've worked on quite heavily in the lab in some of the studies that I did with Zach a few years back. So early on, there was a paper that came out that looked at what signals really contribute to this idea of thermal discomfort. And thermal discomfort is particularly important because without thermal discomfort, we don't have that drive to engage in behavior. So we need these signals to help us understand that we're thermally uncomfortable, and that's when we're going to engage in appropriate behavior. Now, in this paper, don't worry about all the details of it, but really what they found was that at passive rest, at least, core and skin temperature equally contribute to our perception of thermal discomfort overall. Oops, sorry, those aren't meant to be there. But following on from that, we wanted to look at what are those signals that are contributing to cooling behavior itself in more moderate intensity exercise. And what we found in the laboratory, we use a couple of different models where we provide cooling at the back of the neck when people want to receive that. And what we found is that during exercise, we see that core temperature contributes about 75% of that signal to engaging cooling behaviors, while skin temperature only contributes about 25% of that signal. So in instances where we're creating metabolic heat, that's going to drive that desire to engage in cooling behavior a bit more. Moving on from that, though, we had this question about, when you're in hot and humid environments, there's a level of discomfort that kind of tends to come to play as well. You feel a bit sticky, but potentially that idea of humidity on the skin or wettedness on the skin can add to that level of discomfort and potential engagement in behavior as well. So when we talk about skin wetness, that's really the fraction of skin that's wet due to sweat. And if we look on the figure on the y-axis, we see our increasing levels of heat stress with skin and core temperature increasing. And that as that thermal discomfort increases, we hypothesized that skin wettedness, that signal from skin wettedness was going to add and contribute to those levels of thermal discomfort and also cooling behavior. And the important thing about skin wetness is that it's not just that your skin is wet and you're sweating, but that sweat on your skin provides afferent feedback as well through our mechano and thermoreceptors at the skin. And so we can actually interpret that and decide to act on it too. We kind of verified this in the lab where, again, we incorporated that into our analyses to determine whether or not skin wetness contributes to that desire to engage in cooling behavior. And sure enough, we saw that at least during exercise, when we start to sweat and that wettedness response is occurring, we can contribute at least 50% of that cooling behavior to a level of skin wettedness itself. And that core and skin temperature response actually reduces to about 25% each. Now, importantly, the next study that we wanted to do was understand if skin wetness, independent of increases of core and skin temperature, can result in cooling behavior as well. And so in order to do this, we looked at, we put people in a passive heat suit, essentially. And what we did is we manipulated the humidity in the environment itself so that the skin, the fraction of wetness on the skin would be greater in our high humidity environment and lesser in our low humidity environment. But the core temperature and the skin temperature throughout the trial would be identical. And indeed, what we saw here was that when that level of skin wetness was greater, we had a greater engagement in cooling behaviors that occurred. So you can see that total time spent in cooling was much higher in the high skin wetness environment compared to the low skin wetness environment. So why does this matter? It seems like a lot of mumble jumble lab stuff, but what we really started thinking about after this was there are a lot of individuals who might be more physiologically vulnerable. We know that aging, there's age-related decrements in sweating, for example, and if those people don't have that level of skin wettedness or aren't perceiving that signal, are they behaving appropriately in warm environments? It's something that we need to to consider. And the same thing goes for people who might be on medications that might impair sweating and things like this. These are unanswered questions that we're still working on, by the way. So the next factor that comes to play is really motivation. We did a couple of one in particular experiment that looked at in the lab, how do a physical barrier to engaging in behavior, how does that affect our behavioral response? Briefly, we put participants through a 40-degree simulated heat wave, 10% humidity, or simulated environment anyway. And we allowed them to behave in one trial where they just got to press a button and receive cooling on their upper body. They're wearing that water-perfused suit again as often as they wanted to. And then in the second trial, they had to hold a hand grip for a certain amount of time to receive that cooling. So that physiological deterrent or that motivational deterrent itself reduced the amount of time that people engaged in those cooling behaviors. So you might liken this to, if someone's in their home and their remote for the air conditioner, if they have air conditioner, is upstairs, how long will they wait until they walk upstairs to go and turn their air conditioner on? Obviously, these are very controlled environments, and so understanding the application of this outside of the lab is the next step that we hope to pursue with this grant with Jenni. Outside of that, some people would probably know this paper very well because there is some authors from Tempe here where they looked at energy poverty or the energy equity gap and how that contributes to these motivational responses, finding that low-income households tend to forego the use of cooling until later in the summer compared to their high-income counterparts. And another example of those motivational deterrents are in particular instances where you have migrant or agricultural workers who are working for piece rate, where they get paid by the amount that they're picking. There's a study that's been done on return Nepali migrant workers showing that their levels of chronic kidney disease are much higher, and that's likely because they're not stopping to rest and taking that engaging those behavioral strategies because their motivation is so high to try and obtain as much in a given day as they can. And finally, we talked a little bit about this in a session that we had earlier with some of our colleagues here, where the motivation in certain occupations, such as the military, can be extremely detrimental to engaging in behavior. There's lots of reasons for people to push beyond their potential capacity. And for instance, we see that in very long marches or field training exercises, there's a much greater incidence of heat exhaustion and heat injury because people are pushing themselves, whether because they're in a pack or they're working to get certain medals or things like that. So finally, or not quite finally, but the next thing that really comes into play when we think about behavioral responses to heat is whether or not people have access. And this arguably, to me, is one of the most important things. And I don't have to probably stress this much here because we did see the people who don't have access around Phoenix yesterday, obviously being the most vulnerable to the heat overall. But do people have accesses to the resources they need to actually engage in that behavior? One of our great examples, this comes from the Northern Territory in Australia, some work by Simon Quilty, where there's a lack of access to consistent energy and resources. The government decided to put solar power on their homes up in the Northern Territory, but they didn't actually connect the solar power panels throughout the summer when they put them on. So that in itself is a big failure of policy and of people who have the power to do things to help people. In addition to that, there's people up there who don't have refrigerators, but go to the doctor. Chronic kidney disease is a very large issue in this area. Go to the doctor or prescribe different medications that have to be kept in a refrigerator, but the clinicians don't even ask, do they have a refrigerator at home to store these medications? So things like this type of access is crucial to ensuring that people can engage in those behavioral responses appropriately. And finally, this actually wasn't in our paper, but it's come up in conversations more recently, this idea of experience. And I think this is something that everyone here in Phoenix can relate to quite dramatically. there's a certain level of experience that comes to play when it comes to understanding how to behave appropriately and the type of behavioral adaptations that need to be made. There's some research out there that shows, we talked about this a lot earlier in a session as well, people living in a warm climate might express a certain level of apathy. They think that they're more acclimatized, and so they are less at risk in this instance. But the question here is, how does that actually affect behavior? Because it's almost counterintuitive in the sense that perceived acclimatization might suggest that they have a level of improved thermal comfort in these conditions. And if they don't experience that discomfort, then they might not appropriately engage in the behavior that's needed. I suppose the counter to that is that experience of the hot weather repeatedly might improve their behavioral adaptation overall. But we really need some further data to support why it is that people perceive themselves less at risk, and are they compensating in a behavioral response in those instances. But most likely it's that combination of the physiological and behavioral adaptations that are occurring in these situations. So I guess really at the end of the day, when we put this thermophysiology and individual lens on human behavior during extreme heat and heat waves, our take-home messages kind of come down to these three things. There are certain modulators of human behavior during extreme heat. That is specifically access to the cooling resources that they need, clean water to hydrate, affordable and reliable energy to make sure that they can engage in these behaviors appropriately. And then there's also those motivational elements and individual factors that come into play. And if those things are kind of in check, where we have a bit of greater protection from extreme heat, and if they're lacking a bit, we're probably more on the vulnerable side in terms of our behavioral vulnerability. Oh. And then I guess the last thing, as I mentioned, is that all of this is likely to be underpinned by a certain level of experience, behavioral adaptation that occurs, and different knowledge and education that someone might have at a given time. And with that, I will just thank everybody and turn it back over to Jenni for Nick.
Okay, so with all of that information, we're going to wrap it up with a brief overview by Dr. Ravanelli of the heat suite system. That is we're starting to use to try and get at a lot of these things. Why is behavior changing? What is it at your personal level that's affecting you? So he's developed this heat suite system that he's going to go through here for us. And he couldn't be here. He's on his way to Singapore. Nick was at Lakehead University in Canada and now is moving to National University of Singapore.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Nicholas Ravanelli, and I'm an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today about the technological capacity I've been developing in my lab over the last 2 years, which we have now started to call Heat Suite. I apologize for not being able to present in person today. It is likely that me, my wife, our 2 boys, and dog are somewhere over the Pacific Ocean right now while you watch this presentation as we officially move to Singapore. This recording may also include a toddler playing and a screaming infant in the background as we try to pack up our remaining fares before our flights. I would like to start off by saying I'm a physiologist and not an engineer by training. However, I have always maintained a keen interest in technology, especially in finding ways to create new, often cheaper solutions to collect the data we researchers desire. In 2016, during my PhD, I designed and coded my first all-in-one data acquisition system. I then dabbled with the idea of a sweat weight wearable in 2019. However, that dream was quickly abandoned when I became aware of a superior product that tackled the problem in a similar way. In 2020, I created my first custom circuit board for a low-cost 8-channel T-type thermocouple temperature sensor box we used in my lab in the early days. I then began refining my software design with Daiquiri, a free open-source browser-based data acquisition solution that's hosted on GitHub, and I encourage you to check it out if you think it might be of any use for you in your lab. And more recently, I developed a custom web application called Active Heatwave that could programmatically monitor families' local weather for heat alerts and sent surveys for them to complete on those days. The findings from that study were published last year, and this project likely nudged me to see if I could could combine my hardware and software skills to develop a more comprehensive data collection tool to better understand what makes people heat vulnerable in the natural setting. During the first year of piecing together the web application for active heatwave, the Pacific Northwest heat dome occurred, which resulted in record-breaking temperatures and surges in morbidity and mortality. One city in British Columbia, Lytton, broke its own highest temperature record, the Canadian record, for 3 consecutive days. When reviewing the Chief Coroner report for British Columbia following the heat dome, it consisted of some well-known outcomes of extreme heat events, like the rise in mortality, the 911 calls that had doubled, the higher mortality among those with comorbidities such as COPD, mental health disorders, and asthma, and that many of them were elderly individuals above the years of 70 years of age. What was most intriguing to me was that the overwhelming majority of deaths had occurred indoors. This represented something that we just simply could not fully reproduce in the lab, and to me, it was a problem I could try and solve with technology. In 2021, I received funding from the New Frontiers and Research Fund to develop and implement the solution to the problem I identified. However, I admittedly gave it a really poor name at the start. The remote data collection system, called PERMS at the time, was going to capture environmental, perceptual, and key physiological data of heat-vulnerable populations within the comfort of their homes during the hottest parts of the year. The secondary objectives of the system was to be low cost to enable larger sample size, scalable both between and within a home, simple to use even for individuals who might not be comfortable with technology, and without the need of multiple applications and head units from various wearables. Make it so it's expandable for future research needs and technological development. And lastly, complete data governance to ensure researchers and participants retain control of all the data collected, emulating that true data collection that we have in the lab. Over the last 2 years, I've refined a low-cost and scalable remote data collection solution that enables acquisition of key physiological data pertinent to heat stress, such as heart rate, blood pressure, core temperature, proxy measures of hydration status, such as urination frequency, activity, sleep, the ability to ask right here, right now questions for perceptual responses, and possibility to get a greater indoor and outdoor accuracy of the conditions and individuals truly exposed to at any given time. The nodes are built to be offline first, but can be connected to an online cloud companion for remote monitoring by the research team, which I will briefly demonstrate later. This allows for multiple units to be set up at various dwellings throughout its community or globally that we can all monitor in quasi-real time. At its core, HeatSuite consists of 2 main devices, environmental nodes and the open source launchers running our software. The nodes monitor key environmental characteristics, but also serve as the hub. It stores data locally, sends to the cloud over Wi-Fi or cellular networks, has integrated battery life for 72 hours, which is critical for potential burnouts. It monitors user proximity, which will make more sense on the next slide, and each thing can contain multiple smaller nodes to facilitate multi-room monitoring for environmental conditions. The watch software becomes an extension of the researcher, collecting data from various sensors, participants for completion of study tasks, collects raw data from its own internal systems, supports multiple language and study designs, and here right now are completely free for the researcher and team to control. Here's an example of what a right now question would look like on the watch for the participant to respond to. Features come in HeatSuite include location-specific question prompt, such that if you're in a certain condition or a room at a given time, they with a specific question. Also, the capacity of multiple sections as well. We have implementation of HeatSuite in Montreal this summer, with data collection being led by student Carly, who is in person on my behalf. So please feel free to ask her any questions on this. We currently have 28 heat vulnerable residing in income housing and continue June to September. 3/4 are diagnosed with one mental health disorder and a factor for health outcome extreme heat. To summarize the design, participants oral temperature daily, during urine, wanting to write now questions a day, continue in the wash. Next, will highlight the of the cloud system data. Current and nodes to their
why it's doing that. It didn't do it last night, so it's not just his recording. So I'll just run through this very quickly, and Carly's here because it's almost done to answer these questions. But he's just showing that he's deployed these heat suites in 28 homes, Carly, in Montreal, and we actually currently have 10 in Phoenix right now across the valley. And it's showing all the green, like it's showing which are connected to the cloud, how they can see the live data in real time, both physiological responses, a lot of their responses on their watches in real time that they're talking about their thermal comfort and so forth, and then the temperatures and so forth in their houses, and then in multiple rooms in their houses too. And so Carly is here, is the student on this. And then let me see.
understand how individuals respond, both behaviorally and physiological, to extreme heat in their natural settings. I'd like
Okay. I'm gonna let
to thank you again for the opportunity to present this work today and for accommodating my unique scheduling conflict. I am sorry I'm not available to be in person for any questions. However, please feel free to send me any questions or comments via email as you see on the screen above. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. Well, clap for Nick. I don't know. And so now I know we're are we at 1 already? We're almost at 1, but there are time for questions. If you have questions for myself, for James, for Nicole, Carly's here to answer more questions on the heat suite system. Giselle just went and grabbed the heat suite from the lab upstairs if you just want to see what it looks like. We'll put it on the table here for you to see, but it's got the watch and all the nodes that are connected to the cloud. So, and like I said, we have 10 of these around, or 9 of these right now set up around the Phoenix area, monitoring people as they go about their daily lives in their homes. And so, yeah, let's, should we pull chairs out, or do you guys just want to stay there and answer questions? Okay, well, if anyone has questions, put your hand up and Danae will bring you a microphone. And then.
Thank you for the awesome presentation. I'm Ray, working with Decision Theater. I have a question. So the talk is majority about personal level heat exposure, strengths, and stress. I wonder how could local government planners and policymakers, which usually their tool set is more grand scale, like cooling street, cooling centers, how could they use this personal level information to make decisions? And compared to personal level heat exposure, we also have place level heat exposure. Do you recommend use personal level heat exposure analysis to replace place-based heat exposure or vulnerability indexes? Or do you think there's a way to combine both to help decision makers? Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Do that anyone? Answer?
Thank you for the, oh, that was very loud. Thank you for the question. A few questions in there, I think. I think you're completely right that it's a complex problem that requires solutions both at the personal level and longer term kind of macro level that might encompass building modifications, smart city designs. But those longer term or those macro scale interventions are, I think, bigger picture, longer term solutions to the problem of heat. The advantage of the personal level cooling solutions is that they're accessible and usable immediately. So they can almost be viewed as the first defense when hot weather strikes. But of course, we need sensible long-term city planning to make our cities more heat smart and more heat resilient. But I think the two can go hand in hand.
I think also what you brought up is really important. Phoenix does this incredibly well in terms of having the cooling hubs or the cooling resources center. And again, that comes back to this idea of, do people have access? And if behavior is the real primary protective strategy for individuals, you know, whether or not there's access for them is so important. But whilst this is happening in Phoenix right now, I don't think there's a lot of forward thinking in other areas, especially potentially in Australia, where we come from, and even around the United States, and also in lower economic areas or other countries as well. So when it comes to that policy and driving policy, I think some of the work that we're trying to do can help inform why it is so important to have access and to have resources, and the health risks that come with that if you don't have the access to those potential resources as well.
And last thing I will say is Melissa Guardaro, where are you, is on this grant and heat governance, right? So where does heat governance come into place when we're talking to cities and decision makers and communities and neighborhoods and so forth? And who's using some of this information to make decisions at those levels, whether it's to open cooling centers and have them open for extended hours of the day or overnight, because we know how sleep is affected. And so it's part of that too. And who's paying attention to heat? And as a lot of you know, Phoenix is the only publicly funded heat office, has the only publicly funded heat office in the nation. And that's because Melissa, what's your quote? Heat is everybody's problem. Right, so, except now for Dave. So at the city level, it used to be heat was everybody's problem here. It was affecting all the departments, but it was nobody's responsibility. Now, in that the structure, governance structure in the city is that heat is the heat office's problem, and they work with all the other departments to help them with this problem. And so that's part of even thinking about what's the walk like to the bus stop. And because we have not the best transit systems, especially compared to some other cities with our visitors as they've figured out, people are much more exposed to the heat here because the bus just won't show up, or it's just not a very good transit system for getting around such a massive area of the city because of how the valley is designed. So there's things like that that comes into play when we're talking to decision makers, urban planners, and so forth with a lot of this data. How do we bring cooling to the places where people are?
Hi, yeah, really interesting work. I wondered if you're thinking a little bit about the threshold at which we may, as a kind of a policy effort, need to be actually helping people cope with greater levels of heat rather than trying to protect them. You know, so obviously there's the kind of extreme case where people are exposed and really maybe not be aware that they're needing immediate attention. But there's also another situation where we've buffered ourselves from the signals of heat, and we are at a kind of systemic level encouraging living in environments in ways that may ultimately not be sustainable, dependence on air conditioning, which then fails, or, you know, are there other angles of looking at kind of personal behavior that allows us to live in a warmer climate in ways that we may be unwilling behaviorally to do if we have access now. So I'm kind of thinking of the flip side of the people who've been fairly protected. And is there something that needs to happen on that side of the equation to become more more able to cope with higher temperatures?
I think that's a really good point to raise. And my first response when listening to you there is I think a lot of that comes down to education, heat health education, educating people about the health impacts of heat, but also educating them on what we might consider fairly common sense strategies to help protect themselves at an individual level. And these strategies don't necessarily have to rely on air conditioning, which we really need to try to encourage, because that's a fairly maladaptive coping strategy, be it through fairly simple, accessible personal cooling strategies, self-dousing with water, turning on an electric fan instead of your AC as the first resort, or just making common sense decisions about planning your day when you go about engaging in physical activity. Walking to pick up your groceries earlier in the morning before it gets hotter in the peak of the day. Simple common strategies, but this requires community education, and I think that would be most effective if that's implemented at the very earliest level in the school system. So by the time we get into adulthood, we're more heat health literate to make these heat smart decisions.
I might just add to that. There is some idea and a little bit of literature coming out now in terms of how can we better acclimatize ourselves to live in these environments. And, you know, the reality, as James pointed out, is that you really have to be exposed to these environments for very long durations, long periods of time, and potentially with a level of exertion as well to really feel that physiological acclimatization that can provide that protection. And whilst that sounds like a great idea, if you've actually put yourself through those scenarios, it's not really comfortable. And the reality is, I don't think a lot of people will seek that active level of acclimatization, physiologically speaking anyways, to protect themselves better in these environments. So I think it's a bit of a challenging one if you want to flip that side of it to say, how can we improve our adaptive capacity without that behavioral side? You know, there's little you can do, and when you try to do it, it's rather uncomfortable. So trying to seek this out can be challenging. I think people in Phoenix are probably some of the, you know, more exposed to these kind of environments, but the fact that we're sitting in air conditioning right now will tend to negate any of those effects that you might see unless you're out doing physical activity in the hot weather for, you know, repeatedly.
Test. Thank you all for the presentations. This is really exciting to see so much topical research on this in one place. My main question is about data access. So particularly James from the lab that you described in Australia, but also the heat suite work that's being done. Are those kinds of time series data available only in the form of publications, or is there any effort to have a centralized database? And with that, my second question is whether there's any effort through this grant, or if you know of others, to represent more human subjects from tropical climates. So thinking about places in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, just closer to the equator. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly about the data situation from our lab. Of course, the bulk of the data are published and findable in the literature. Not a whole lot of the raw data is open access currently, but as we kind of start moving towards conducting larger funded projects, that's definitely something that we're making a concerted effort to do. And moving forward, we will make sure our data are open access and accessible for others to use. And I think Jenni can speak more about the data situation with the heat suite study.
Yeah, and I would have to ask Nick about that because it's his baby, which is right there now, in terms of when we would make that accessible. And of course, there's a lot of de-identification that needs to happen, because if you have low sample size of people, then you really have to be careful about what you share and publish. But there are ways around that to make sure it's accessible. And another thing that people here at ASU are working on in Konrad Rajkowski's lab with our colleague, Dr. Joshi, is just making more models accessible and open source code so that with all of this data, we can actually model the heat strain with the environmental and behavioral variables that we're collecting. So I think that's an important point too. A lot of models in this space are very black box, or not accessible. And we're trying to make that more accessible through different types of coding platforms. And I'm forgetting your second question already.
It was about representing folks from the tropical regions.
Thank you. So in January, Giselle is going to be going to Colombia and taking hopefully the 10 heat suites here with her to do the exact same data collection there. A very different situation in terms of the cities that she'll be studying regarding air conditioning access and people's behavior in their summer and humidity levels and so forth. And then as we grow our global center, the goal is to study more locations. I think you guys have some work in India with pregnant women, people. And so that can kind of be combined in with a lot of our thinking around this global center to study diverse populations across cultures and climates. We'll take one or two more questions. We should wrap it up though. And there's time for discussion after, because there's food in the back, so you can just come chat with us.
I was wondering if you have any plan to incorporate study findings from countries like Bangladesh, India with high humidity and temperature, because tomorrow's temperature in Dhaka will be 33 degrees Celsius and you will feel like 38 degrees Celsius. And these countries mostly densely populated with low income people with very limited access to resources, also the government. So adaptive capacity of the poor, vulnerable people is really very important. So this in these countries, for instance, I'm from Bangladesh. I can say that in most of the people, those who are vulnerable has limited access to electricity. So consider, considering cooling facility, creating cooling facility is next to impossible. Thank you.
Yeah, so Bangladesh has actually been an area of interest for us in recent years. We've just conducted a large study looking at sustainable cooling strategies for the ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh, specifically Dhaka. And what that study involved was we first monitored the environmental conditions inside a ready-made garment factory for an entire year, identified the hot and humid parts of the year inside that factory, identified the hot spots within that factory, and then systematically tested different low-cost sustainable cooling strategies to help alleviate the heat stress faced by these workers. And the climate where in Bangladesh, where it's often both hot and humid, is very interesting because some low-cost sustainable cooling strategies that might work in Sydney, for example, such as self-dousing with water, are less effective in very humid environments because that water can't evaporate and provide us cooling relief. But what we did find is other low-cost strategies, such as turning on an electric fan, increasing forced convection throughout the factory, that did become effective in humid environments because that additional airflow encouraged the evaporation of sweat from the skin and provided both physiological relief and also perceptual relief to the workers. So that's a good example of finding sustainable cooling strategies that fit the location of interest, and they have to be be appropriate for implementation. So we're trying that.
One more question.
Stavros Kavouras, College of Health Solutions. For the heat suite, which is super interesting data, do you record any data what happens if those individuals pay time, they spend time outside of their household? Like, could that trigger like a behavior that you probably miss it when you measure everything at home?
Yep. So at least for the Phoenix subjects, participants, all of them have a kestrel drop that they bring with them everywhere. So we always know their exposure to temperature and humidity no matter where they go. And we have then the watch that they wear that gives them the real-time surveys and collects heart rate, skin temperature, so forth. Also has a GPS on it. So we know where they are exposed to what, when. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then we know then that if they might be changing their behaviors based on the heat intensity that they're exposed to, or if they go for a run, we'll know they go for a run, things like that. So that's all part of the data analysis, and Giselle has more to add. This is Giselle's PhD dissertation.
And also, like addition in what Jenni said, the node communicates all the time with the smartwatch. Then we have how to know if the people was at home. So that's kind of then the flags that we need to like harmonize the data in order to be able to describe the exposure in detail.
Yeah, so the watch syncs with the node, and the node sends the data to us in real time. But we always know kind of if they're home, and then even if they're home and the temperatures in their home are very high, we give them a call to see how are you doing and make sure they're okay. Okay, we should wrap up because we're taking too much time. Thank you for coming. Mary has brought some cooling towels and misters if anyone would want one. And then there's food at the back that Jacob has there if you can stick around for a little bit longer. So, and when is our next? We don't know when our next one is yet. September 25th is our next seminar, Adam. So awesome. Okay, thanks everyone.
Was the text I wrote okay? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. I can edit anything. I know you're busy. I didn't know where to poke my head in the last 3 days. It's been. Oh, it's been. It's like on top of me teaching.